Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world that's as captivating as it is brutal feudal Japan. A land of fierce honor codes, relentless social hierarchies, and a level of discipline that makes modern routines look like chaos. You may think you could handle it, maybe you've watched a few samurai movies, read some manga, or studied a bit of Bushido philosophy, but trust me, you wouldn't last a single day. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying these deep, immersive, historical journeys. Let me know in the comments where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how far this curious community reaches. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself because we're about to travel back to a time where one wrong word, one misplaced glance, or one failure in etiquette could cost you everything. Forget the romanticized images of cherry blossoms, graceful geishas, and noble warriors posing stoically under moonlight. The real feudal Japan was a complex, often merciless place where your survival depended entirely on your class, your obedience, and your ability to read a room. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, a samurai, or a wandering outsider, the rules were strict, and the consequences were harsh. This wasn't a society built for flexibility or second chances. This was a world where order reigned, and deviation, no matter how small, could bring swift punishment. And don't think you can charm your way through it. In feudal Japan, your speech, your posture, even how you walked and bowed communicated your rank, loyalty, and intentions. There was no room for error. Misread a situation, use the wrong level of politeness, or show disrespect to the wrong person, and your life could be forfeit. Whether you were navigating the streets of Kyoto or stepping into the wooden halls of a daimyo's estate, every action was loaded with meaning. So tonight, we'll explore just why surviving a single day in this intricate, dangerous, and fascinating era would be far more difficult than you think. You'll gain insight into the daily life, strict customs, and relentless expectations that governed everyone from peasants to warlords. This isn't just history, it's a harsh reality check. Let's start with your first obstacle, the social hierarchy. In feudal Japan, you couldn't just be yourself. You were born into a status, and that status defined your entire life, from the clothes you wore to the food you were allowed to eat, and even the way you spoke to others. At the top of the pyramid were the emperor and the imperial family, but their power was mostly symbolic. True authority rested with the shogun, a military dictator who ruled through strength and loyalty. Just below the shogun were the daimyo, powerful land-holding lords who controlled vast territories and commanded their own armies of samurai. Beneath them came the samurai themselves, warriors who lived by the strict code of Bushido, a philosophy centered on loyalty, self-discipline, and honor unto death. And then came the rest, peasants, artisans, and merchants, each with clearly defined roles, duties, and limits. Peasants, despite their low status, were considered essential because they produced food. Artisans were valued for their skills, especially in crafting swords or armor. But merchants, despite often being wealthier than the classes above them, they were placed at the bottom of the social order, because they didn't produce anything of tangible value. Accumulating riches by selling goods was seen as morally inferior to planting rice or forging steel. Now imagine being dropped into this rigid framework as a modern outsider. You'd have no rank, no place, no identity, just a confusing maze of unspoken rules, layers of protocol, and a constant risk of offending someone without even realizing it. Your body language would betray you, your informal speech would insult people, and your inability to properly bow could be seen as disrespect. Even your appearance, your hair, your posture, your clothing would make you stick out like a sore thumb, and not in a way that earns curiosity or kindness. In a world where harmony and hierarchy were sacred, individuality wasn't celebrated, it was dangerous. And if you thought you could talk your way out of trouble, think again. Silence was often safer than speech, and speaking out of turn could easily be mistaken for rebellion. Next up, your daily routine. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you somehow ended up as a peasant, which, realistically, would be your best case scenario. Life wasn't just hard, it was relentless. You'd wake up before dawn, likely on a straw mat, in a drafty wooden home with no insulation, no plumbing, and no privacy. The first thing you'd do, work all day. In the fields, planting rice, harvesting crops, or repairing tools. There were no weekends, no vacations, and definitely no personal time. Your entire existence revolved around survival and obedience. Food was basic and repetitive. A bowl of rice, some miso soup if you were lucky, and maybe pickled vegetables. Meat was rare and expensive, mostly reserved for the higher classes. Even if you were starving, hunting game without permission could get you executed. Your clothing would be rough, homemade, and purely functional, designed to last, not to impress. Bathing was infrequent and dependent on the availability of clean water, which wasn't always easy to come by. And don't even think about complaining. Speaking out against your lord or questioning your conditions wasn't brave, it was suicidal. You were expected to know your place, fulfill your duties, and keep your head down, literally and figuratively. Step out of line, and you could be punished on the spot. Public floggings, forced labor, or even execution weren't uncommon, and they served as grim reminders to everyone else. Obedience was survival. Now, imagine being thrust into that world with none of the physical endurance, cultural understanding, or historical context. You'd be overwhelmed in minutes, confused by the expectations, terrified of making a wrong move, and exhausted by a way of life that made no allowances for weakness. Even simple acts like how you enter a room, how you sit, how you eat were governed by ritual and expectation. If you didn't know how to kneel properly, how to pour tea without insult, or how to address someone of higher status, you'd be setting yourself up for disaster. In a culture that valued order above all, ignorance wasn't an excuse, it was a liability. Now, let's say just for fun that you were somehow born into the samurai class. Sounds like an upgrade, right? Prestige, power, maybe a cool sword. Think again. Being a samurai wasn't about glory, it was about constant pressure. You were expected to live and die by the code of Bushido, a strict set of rules demanding absolute loyalty, discipline, self-sacrifice, and honor above all. This wasn't the romanticized version you've seen in movies. It was brutal, unforgiving, and rigid. From the moment you could walk, your training would begin. You'd be taught martial arts, swordsmanship, horseback riding, and the use of bows and spears. Physical strength was essential, but so was mental and emotional control. A samurai was not allowed to show fear, hesitation, or defiance. You were a servant to your lord, and disobedience, no matter how small, could lead to death, either by punishment or by your own hand. That's right, seppuku. The ritual of self-disablement was not just a punishment, it was a duty. If you brought shame to yourself or your master, you were expected to take your own life with honor. No second chances, no redemption arc, just a short blade, a final breath, and the hope that your death would restore your family's name. Even in peace, your life wasn't easy. You were constantly being watched, judged, and tested. Samurai were expected to act as moral examples, stoic, composed, and above reproach. Indulgence was frowned upon. Excess was dangerous. Emotions were liabilities, and failure unacceptable. Interactions with those beneath your rank had to be handled with calculated grace, while deference to those above had to be absolute. One insult, one gesture interpreted as arrogance or disrespect, and your entire life could unravel in a matter of moments. You lived every day with a sword at your side, not just to defend honor, but as a reminder that your own life was always on the line. So if you think being a warrior in feudal Japan meant charging into battle in shining armor with dramatic music swelling behind you, think again. It was a life of restraint, obligation, and endless vigilance. And unless you were born into it, molded by it, and absolutely committed to every rule it imposed, you wouldn't survive it. Now, maybe you're thinking, alright, I'll just lay low, keep quiet, and avoid trouble. But in feudal Japan, even doing nothing could get you killed. This wasn't a society that tolerated vagueness or passivity. Everything you did or didn't do had meaning. Silence could be interpreted as disrespect. Hesitation could be seen as weakness. Looking someone directly in the eyes, that could be a challenge. Not looking at them at all, that might be even worse. Etiquette was everything. From how low you bowed to whom you bowed to first. Social interaction was a minefield. There were multiple forms of language depending on the social rank of the person you were speaking to. Use the wrong word, the wrong tone, or speak out of turn, and you could insult someone without even realizing it. And the consequences weren't just awkward, they could be fatal. You might imagine you could just stick to yourself, blend in, but being an outsider in a closed, rigid society made that nearly impossible. Foreigners were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. If you didn't speak the language fluently, follow customs perfectly, or show the right amount of deference, you risked becoming a target, whether through legal punishment, social exclusion, or even violent retaliation. There was no such thing as anonymity. Communities were tight-knit, and reputations traveled fast. If you broke a rule, everyone would know immediately. And unlike today, where you might get a warning or a slap on the wrist, Justice in feudal Japan could be swift and merciless. You weren't just responsible for your own behavior, you were also expected to uphold the honor of your family, your village, and even your ancestors. One mistake could dishonor them all, and heaven help you if you were caught lying, stealing, or dishonoring your superior. There were punishments designed not just to correct, but to humiliate and serve as a warning to others. Public beatings, forced labor, exile or worse. In some cases, your punishment could extend to your family. That's how seriously order and loyalty were taken. So no, you couldn't just keep your head down and ride it out. In feudal Japan, survival meant absolute awareness, flawless conduct, and unwavering obedience every single day. And let's not forget the environment itself. The natural world in feudal Japan wasn't exactly forgiving. Depending on the region and the season, you could be dealing with freezing winters, typhoons, rice crop failures, earthquakes, or blistering summer heat with no modern comforts to soften the blow. There was no central heating, no air conditioning, no supermarkets, and definitely no emergency services. If your roof collapsed during a storm or your harvest failed, you were on your own. You either found a way to endure or you didn't. Disease was another constant threat. With limited medical knowledge and poor sanitation, infections spread easily and cures were often based on superstition rather than science. A simple cut could lead to death. Epidemics could wipe out entire villages. And unless you were wealthy or part of the ruling class, access to care, whatever little there was minimal. Even childbirth came with terrifying odds for both mother and child. And war, that was always just around the corner. Power struggles between rival clans, shifting alliances, and uprisings meant that violence could erupt without warning. One day you're tending rice in peace. The next, your village is caught in a conflict you didn't start and can't escape. Armies moved fast, and they weren't always merciful. Pillaging, forced conscription, or worse, could befall anyone in the path of a warring faction. Neutrality wasn't an option. Even the samurai, with all their training and honor, were never truly safe. Their loyalty could be demanded one day and discarded the next. A change in leadership or a failed alliance could cost them their land, their status or their heads. Betrayal wasn't uncommon, and death often came not in glorious battle, but in political purges or retaliatory strikes. Feudal Japan wasn't just a tough place to survive, it was a constant test of endurance, adaptability, and discipline. Every element of life, from nature to politics to disease, could turn against you without warning, and unless you were born into the system and conditioned to its demands from day one, your odds of making it through even a single day were slim to none. Even entertainment in feudal Japan wasn't about relaxation in the way we understand it today. Every form of leisure, from the performing arts to festivals, was steeped in ritual, hierarchy, and often, political meaning. You couldn't just walk into a kabuki theater, kick back, and casually enjoy a show. Seating, behavior, and even your reactions were dictated by your status. Laugh too loudly, clap at the wrong moment, or fail to show proper appreciation for a lord's favorite actor, and you could quickly find yourself escorted out or worse, humiliated. Music, dance, poetry, and storytelling all had their place, but participation was rarely spontaneous or freeform. Traditional arts like the tea ceremony or no theater were not only performances, they were exercises in discipline, patience, and cultural literacy. If you didn't understand the symbolism, the gestures, or the timing, you were more likely to appear foolish than entertained. Even drinking sake was a ritualized act. Cups were offered in a precise order, and etiquette dictated who poured for whom, and when. The same principle applied to religion and spirituality. Shinto and Buddhism shaped every aspect of daily life, from household customs to political decisions. Temples and shrines weren't just places of prayer, they were deeply embedded in the rhythm of society. Ignoring religious practices or offending local spirits kami could result in real social consequences. Even funerals followed strict protocols. One misstep in a ritual might not just insult the dead, but bring shame upon an entire family. Marriage wasn't about love or personal connection, it was about alliances, duty, and producing heirs. Most unions were arranged, often when individuals were still in their early teens. Women were expected to be obedient, modest, and skilled in domestic duties. Men were expected to lead with honor, protect the family's status, and provide. Romantic affection was not a priority, duty was. And divorce, while technically possible, it was heavily stigmatized, especially for women. Gender roles were strictly defined and deeply enforced. A woman speaking out of turn, dressing improperly, or engaging in behavior outside her assigned role could face social exile or worse. Meanwhile, a man failing to fulfill his role as provider or protector could be seen as shameful or weak. There was very little flexibility in how one could live or express themselves. Everything had to align with tradition, expectation, and collective harmony. In short, life in feudal Japan was lived for the individual. It was lived for the group, the family, the class, the clan, the empire. Every decision you made, every word you spoke, every gesture you offered had to consider your position and how it affected the wider structure, and stepping out of line even unknowingly could unravel everything. Education, too, followed a rigid path if you even had access to it. For the elite, particularly the children of samurai or nobility, education was a tool not for personal growth, but for mastering the expectations of their class. Boys were trained in writing with brush and ink, in classical Chinese texts, in military history, and in tactical strategy. Girls, if educated, were taught poetry, music, calligraphy, etiquette, and household management skills that reinforced their roles as refined, obedient companions in elite marriages. But for the vast majority peasants, artisans, laborers, formal education was either minimal or non-existent. Instead, knowledge was passed down through repetition and family labor. You learned how to plant, how to harvest, how to survive. You inherited your father's tools, your mother's cooking methods, your community's unspoken rules. Curiosity wasn't encouraged, it was dangerous. Too many questions could make you seem arrogant or rebellious. And trying to rise above your station through learning, that could be perceived as a challenge to the natural order. Even language was stratified. Japanese has complex layers of politeness embedded into its grammar. Entire verb forms change depending on who you're speaking to. One version for someone below you, another for equals, and an entirely different and far more complex version for superiors. Make one mistake, use the wrong level of honorifics, and you might insult someone powerful without even knowing it. For a modern speaker used to casual, direct conversation, this would be a social trap waiting to spring. And don't expect freedom of movement. Travel in feudal Japan was tightly controlled. If you wanted to leave your village, you often needed permission. Roads were watched, bridges were taxed, and checkpoints were common. Unless you had a very good reason delivering goods, official duty, religious pilgrimage, you stayed where you were born. Outsiders passing through were viewed with suspicion, and questions would be asked. Who are you? Why are you here? Who sent you? If your answers weren't satisfactory, you could be detained or worse. Feudal Japan was not a place for spontaneous dreams or impulsive decisions. The very structure of society was designed to eliminate unpredictability. Stability mattered more than innovation. Obedience mattered more than ambition. You didn't make your path, you followed it. And for anyone raised in a world that celebrates individuality, change, or personal freedom, stepping into that system would feel like suffocation. Let's now talk about justice, or rather, the brutal efficiency of feudal justice. In modern society, you might expect a trial, a defense, maybe even a second chance. Not so in feudal Japan. Justice was swift, harsh, and often final. For most of the population, especially the lower classes, rights were limited, and punishments were more about setting public examples than rehabilitation. Steal a handful of rice, that could cost you your hand or your life. Speak disrespectfully to a samurai, that might be grounds for immediate execution. Samurai held the legal right to kill commoners who insulted or disrespected them, a power known as kirasut gomen. It didn't matter if the offense was unintentional. If a samurai deemed your behavior dishonorable, you could be struck down on the spot with no legal repercussions for the attacker. Imagine living under that pressure where a simple misstep, misunderstood gesture, or unfortunate glance could end in death. And if you thought the court system would protect you, think again. Local lords and magistrates acted as judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. Corruption wasn't uncommon, and the word of someone with status far outweighed the testimony of a peasant or outsider. Punishments were designed to shame as much as hurt. Public beatings, parading criminals through the village, even crucifixion in extreme cases. Yes, crucifixion was practiced in Japan not as a religious act, but as a form of deterrent and spectacle. Torture was also used in interrogations, particularly for crimes like theft, rebellion, or blasphemy. Confessions, whether true or forced, were central to the process, and once accused, proving innocence was nearly impossible. Social status determined credibility far more than evidence. So if you were lowborn and someone above you wanted you gone, all it took was an accusation and your fate was sealed. Families often shared in the punishment. If you dishonored your clan, you didn't suffer alone. Your actions could bring shame, poverty, or death to those around you. The idea of collective responsibility was deeply rooted in Japanese culture. Personal choices weren't just personal, they echoed across generations. This kept people in line, but it also created a constant atmosphere of pressure and control. Your name, your bloodline, your legacy all hung in the balance with every decision you made. So, think about it. Would you survive a system where justice wasn't about fairness, but about preserving order, punishing dishonor, and maintaining a rigid social pyramid, where apology wasn't enough, and redemption was rarely offered? In feudal Japan, law wasn't designed to protect the individual, it existed to protect the structure, and the structure didn't bend for anyone. Now let's talk about death, not just physical death, but the concept of dying with honor. In feudal Japan, death wasn't always the worst possible outcome. In fact, living with shame was often considered far more unbearable. This belief was rooted deeply in the samurai code of Bushido, but its influence extended throughout society. The idea that your personal honor, your family's name, and your lord's reputation mattered more than your own life created a culture where suicide was not just accepted, was sometimes expected. For samurai, the ultimate expression of loyalty or atonement was seppuku ritual suicide by This wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was highly formalized, conducted with ceremony, witnessed by others, and often followed by a beheading by a trusted second to ensure a swift end. It was gruesome, painful, and symbolic. Refusing to perform seppuku when honor demanded it could condemn your entire family to shame. But the pressure to die with dignity extended beyond the warrior class. If a retainer failed his master, if a soldier surrendered, or if someone brought disgrace to their clan, the honorable path was often seen as death. Women, too, were expected to preserve family honor, sometimes through acts of self-sacrifice during wartime or in moments of extreme dishonor. There are recorded cases of entire households committing suicide together rather than face defeat or capture. Even in stories, plays, and poems of the time, noble death was glorified. Characters who took their lives for honor were admired, while those who begged, fled, or betrayed were forever remembered with disdain. Martyrdom and sacrifice were elevated to near-spiritual ideals, reinforcing a culture that saw death as a meaningful conclusion to a life lived in service and discipline. This creates a psychological environment almost unimaginable by modern standards. You weren't just trying to stay alive, you were trying to die the right way if the time came. Living through humiliation was worse than dying with grace, and that idea, so alien to most of us today, was embedded in education, literature, governance, and spirituality. In feudal Japan, death wasn't the end. It was the final statement of who you were, what you believed, and what legacy you left behind. If you couldn't meet it with honor, then your life had failed its purpose. That level of expectation, that weight, was something everyone carried. Even your dreams weren't really your own. Aspiration, ambition, even imagination, these things were always expected to fit neatly within the boundaries of your role. A peasant dreaming of becoming a warrior, dangerous. A woman hoping to become a political leader, unthinkable. A merchant wishing to climb the social ladder, dishonorable. You didn't get to reinvent yourself in feudal Japan. You were what you were born into, and every attempt to resist that order was seen not as inspiring but as disruptive. Harmony, after all, was everything. Disrupting the social current, even for noble reasons, could be seen as betrayal of the group. And so you learn to adapt, to accept, to conform. You learn to let go of desire and expression and replace it with duty and control. This was not a world designed for personal fulfillment, it was a world built for collective function. Your happiness was secondary to the stability of the whole, and if that sounds stifling, it was. But for those who mastered it, who found peace within the structure, there was a strange sort of freedom. Freedom from the chaos of uncertainty, of identity crises, of existential dread. But don't let that romantic notion fool you. It came at a price, a heavy one. Would you survive a world like that? A world where your thoughts must be measured, your words calculated, your dreams silenced. A place where stepping out of line isn't met with a shrug or a warning but with shame, exile, or death. A society where the group is everything and the individual nothing. That's the question. And maybe the real reason you wouldn't last a day in feudal Japan isn't just because it was hard, but because it was ordered. And maybe what you love most about the world you live in, messy, free, uncertainties, exactly what they feared most about people like you.